So now we're going to look at some of the technology of World War I and how the U.S. enters the war. So technology made huge leaps and bounds. I mean, it was a time period when we had the Industrial Revolution where lots of new inventions were coming out, and technology in warfare was just constantly changing and improving. And in World War I, at the beginning of it, what you have is these old ideas of fighting, like trenches and using horses, coming up against, early versions of machine guns. And you're going to have airplanes being used, and early forms of tanks and submarines. For the Germans, these would be called U-boats. And so, because of all these changes in technology, and still using at the beginning of the war some of these old ideas, we see that the number of men who were hurt or who died were very, very high because of this. So as the war continues, people in the U.S. start to try and figure out, should we enter the war? Should we stay and not enter the war? And there were two main groups in the United States that were against war, the U.S. going to war, and those are going to be the socialists and the pacifists. And they're going to have different reasons. For the socialists, it's going to be that they saw World War I as just a way for countries to take more territories and make more money. For the pacifists, they just believed that war was wrong. And so you don't have everyone in the U.S. just wanting to jump into World War I. In fact, a lot of people were not ready to do that. They needed some pretty big things to happen to kind of change that idea in the U.S. There were some people who would go to Germany and go over to France, especially a lot of pilots who would train and then go and fight for those countries. But the United States is going to stay out for a while until some major things happen. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson that's kind of going to be how he gets reelected, is saying that he's not going to get the U.S. into the war. So what you're looking at here is a picture of the Lusitania, and this was a British liner, and it was supposed to be sailing over, and it had a bunch of passengers on it. Now, previous to this, what had happened was that England blockaded or was stopping Germany from getting ships in and out. They were trying to stop supplies, so food, stuff to help Germany grow food. And so people in Germany were not getting a lot of food. In fact, a lot of them were starving. And so what Germany did was they said, well, we're going to use our submarines or our U-boats, and we're just going to start torpedoing ships that we see until we can start getting some food and supplies in. Well, the Lusitania was out, and what ended up happening was that it was sunk off the coast of Ireland by the Germans. And there were just under 1,200 dead. 128 of those were U.S. citizens. And when people in the U.S. heard about this, it completely changed their mind about the U.S. going into war. Now, the U.S. still isn't going to enter the war, but they're going to begin to threaten Germany and say, if you're going to keep sinking our ships, then we're going to be forced to come in and fight against you. Well, Germany basically said, hey, until we start getting supplies in, we're going to keep sinking ships. And President Wilson, in response to this, basically said, I'm not ready to declare war yet. I'm not ready to go to Congress and ask Congress to declare war. We need what he called overt acts. And basically what that meant was he was looking for something that was so easy to see as, horrible towards the U.S. Like, this is definitely an act of war. Like, Germany is trying to get us to go to war with them before he was going to ask Congress for the U.S. to go into war. So what was it? What were these overt acts that brought the U.S. into the war? Well, the first was something called the Zimmerman Note. And this was a note that was intercepted. It was supposed to be between Germany and Mexico. And what it basically did was said that if Mexico came in on the side of Germany, Germany would give back to Mexico some of the possessions that they had had before the Mexican-American War. The second big thing that happened was 4 more of our merchant ships were sunk by the Germans. And then, if you'll remember, during this time period, the Russian Revolution happens. And when the Russian Revolution happens, the monarchy is replaced, and we get the early forms of communism coming in. And for the U.S., basically what this is it kind of changes what the war is about. And now it can be seen as a war of democracies versus, totalitarian governments. And so that's going to be another reason for the U.S. to enter the war. And that's what happens. Wilson goes to Congress, he makes his war resolution, and war is declared. So you might wonder what it was like on the home front for the U.S., people living in the U.S. At home. There was a lot of propaganda. Propaganda is basically government's ways of trying to get people to like what the government wants you to like, trying to get you on board. They use things like posters, music. They're going to use movies, cartoons, and it's basically, like I said, the government's way of convincing you of what they want you to kind of be in favor of. And so you saw a lot of these in the war. You see Uncle Sam. They use songs, movies, all these kind of things to kind of try and get the American public on board. The government got larger, expanded. They took on more control throughout World War I. Wilson was given a lot more control over the economy. They were able to start to fix some of the prices to make sure that like power prices or prices of certain foods or fuels people weren't just able to charge whatever they wanted. The government now got the right to regulate and actually even nationalize, which means make it basically for the people, certain industries. Volunteer work was really huge during this time. Part of a lot of children's school days was rolling bandages, which you can kind of see over here, knitting socks, and yes, you'll see these are little boys. They would knit socks and send those over to the troops, rolling bandages to send over also. And here's some more. They're rolling these bandages to send over. And this was part of the war effort, and the vast majority of Americans were helping with this. It became a social event for people to get together and do these different things to help out with the war. And here's some of that propaganda like I was talking about. And here's a song, For Your Country and My Country. It's a recruiting song, trying to, help get more men to sign up to fight in the war. In order to get enough men and troops to fight in the war, the Selective Service Act of 1917 was implemented. What this said was that all men aged 18 and older had to register to be drafted. That's still in effect today. Once men hit 18 years of age, they have to register to be drafted. So there were some kind of problems that were going on in the war at home. What we found in the U.S. is that we saw a rise in anti-immigrant, feelings. People were, and there's a lot of reasons behind this. Part of it was what was going on with the revolutions in Russia. Some people were afraid of people's dissent because of what was going on in World War I with the different countries involved. And so what happened was we had a couple of different things put into effect. We had the conformity rule. People who were of Germanic descent a lot of times had problems finding jobs. They might have problems in communities. People might have thought that they were working for the Germans. They actually banned music, books, language that was German, and they changed the names of things that had the word German in it or that were German sounding to Liberty. So you had like Liberty Dogs, Liberty Music, this idea of trying to really promote that nationalism, that pride in the U.S. You also had the Espionage and Sedition Acts that were passed. What this said is that if you said anything bad about the government or the war, or you said, I don't believe in this war, or I think this is bad, you could get a fine or you could be put in jail for speaking up against the government. And like you guys learned earlier on, part of our the First Amendment is freedom of speech, but that went away during this time period in World War I. Women began to take over men's jobs at home as more and more men are shipped overseas. Women and minorities, African Americans especially, began to take on some of the jobs that they had not been able to get it before. But for women, taking over these jobs also helped them to win suffrage, which is also called they're getting the right to vote. A little bit more, during World War I, there was a flu epidemic that hit not just the U.S., but also the world. And during this, affected about 25% of the United States. It had a pretty high death rate also, so that was a huge problem at home also. And here you can see, here's some more propaganda, trying to get more and more women to come out, even on farms. Once the U.S. entered the war, the tide of war began to change. There was a few reasons for this. One, the U.S. started using a convoy system, which basically was you had a bunch of ships that protected your merchant ships so that they couldn't get sunk by the U-boats. They laid mines in the ocean in the North Sea. Think of when you've watched Dory and Finding Nemo. You might have seen those. They're kind of the floating balloons that the sharks are always worried about. Also, when the U.S. troops come in, they are fresh troops. They're enthusiastic, and they come into the setting, and it really kind of gives a little bit of hope to these Allied troops who have been just stuck in these conditions. And now we're just going to watch a little video again.
So America watches World War I from 1914 to April of 1917. And people ask why. Why doesn't America get involved immediately? And American politicians are petrified of being drawn into a foreign war and fighting for foreign ends.
Remember, the United States is a nation of immigrants. People came here to avoid war in Europe.
The Americans had, from the very beginning, an official policy of neutrality. But neutrality never meant indifference or apathy.
Even though we're saying we don't want to involve ourselves, we certainly were sympathetic in trying to help and aid that cause in ways that the Germans saw as being destructive to their war aims. So in all those ways, the Wilson administration is walking a tightrope.
Woodrow Wilson, after all, runs for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And yet within a year after winning that election, that very same president is declaring war on the Germans.
Ultimately, the triggering event that brings us into the war is Germany's decision to revive unrestricted submarine warfare.
added to that, the Germans had managed in a particularly ham-fisted way to try and recruit the Mexicans to come in on their side if America entered the war. And they had offered to return to the Mexicans all the lands they had lost in the 19th century to the US, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. The Germans sent this offer to the Mexicans by telegram, Western Union, of all things. Only what they didn't realize was the Western Union office was in London. And so the British captured the telegram and promptly sent it to the US and released it in public. And that angered the American people so much that, combined with unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson felt that he had to take the US into the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. When America entered the conflict, it changed the war. Although not as much as everybody expected, because just as America was entering the war, Russia was dropping out.
Now, it's a race. As Russia is leaving the war, can the United States get enough troops in to tilt that scale in favor of the Allies?
They brought in the men, the materiel, and the resources that these allies needed desperately.
The French and the British were suffering a sense that the war was stalemated, that defeat might be coming, and the American commitment was a real shot in the arm for both political leaders and for ordinary soldiers in the trenches.
Prior to the outbreak of World War I, America was recognized as a strong young nation. By joining with the Allies and really helping to bring about the end of the war, we positioned ourselves as one of the world powers for the rest of the century.
And so the end of the war will come, and the war will end on November 11th at 11. 11/11/11. This is called Armistice Day. Today it's Vets Day, Veterans Day. And so the Great War ends. Woodrow Wilson came up with this idea to try and make sure that there was a fair agreement, that peace was lasting, that we wouldn't see a war like this ever again. I mean, that's why they called it the war to end all wars, the Great War. And he came up with something called his 14 points, where basically was just kind of an outline of different things that he wanted to see put in place to make sure that a war like this wouldn't happen. One of the key points of this was what's called a League of Nations, which was supposed to be basically where countries could come together and talk about their problems before it escalated to or got into this huge fight again. There's some pretty major effects with World War I, and it really begins with the problems with the peace talks. You can see how World War II is going to start from how World War I ends with the treaty that comes through. Some of the big problems are France wanted to make sure there'd be no more invasion, so going into it, France already has a kind of a chip on its shoulder. It wants to make sure it's not invaded again. Britain wanted to pay back the Germans for the Luftwaffe, the Sky War, and when they had these peace talks, it actually didn't include any of the countries from the Central Powers or Russia, or what was becoming the Soviet Union at the time. When they get together and you have the Treaty of Versailles, they came up with some major points of that, and one of those is that they were going to create 9 new nations, including Poland. France and Britain would get temporary colonies from Germany, so we talked about that imperialism and those colonial possessions or territories. France and Britain kind of got those from Germany. Germany was not allowed to keep an army after this point. They had a demilitarized area. And also they were going to force Germany to pay $33 billion to the Allies as a way of paying them back for the war. Germany lost their land, they lost their colonies, and they really lost, because they lost these colonies and they lost a ton of their land actually in Europe. They lost their way to be able to pay back this money. Another major point of this treaty, and one of the things that kind of leads, once again, into World War II, is it was set out to humiliate Germany and put Germany in its place. And that will lead to a lot of hard feelings, and once again, how we're going to see the rise of World War II. Part of this was what's called the War Guilt Clause. Basically, Germany had to admit sole defeat or sole responsibility of the war. Like, they had to say, yep, it was just us. Nothing else happened. It was just our fault. They also had their no way to repay the debt, like I had said. They lost territory. And surprisingly, the Soviet Union, Russia also lost territory. They actually lost more territory than Germany. And so as we get into the 1920s, and especially as Stalin begins to solidify power in the Soviet Union, they will begin to retake more territory and try and get some of their land back. So we'll watch one more video, which kind of goes over as an overview of World War I.
Countries are becoming more militarized. They're joining forces to become allies. Imperialism is out of control. Nationalism is out of control. And then a bullet kills Franz Ferdinand, a Serbian terrorist from the Black Hand. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, then Russia declares war on them. Germany joins, now it's out of hand.
The Great War.
The war to end the wars.
World War I.
The war to end the wars.
The Great War.
The war to end the wars.
World War I.
The war to end the wars. All meet in Europe, allies over here, Central Powers over there. A race to the sea caused trench warfare. Soon both sides wouldn't be going anywhere. Industrialization caused massive destruction. Machine guns, poison gas tanks, and airplanes. Battle of the Somme was incredibly gory. The two-front war put a strain on Germany. Russia was out, but the United States
The Great War.
The war to end the wars.
World War I.
The war to end the wars.
The Great War.
The war to end the wars.
World War I.
The war to end the wars. Trench foot, shell shock, just stay out of no man's land. So confident going in, now things are getting out of hand. Trench foot, shell shock, just stay out of no man's land. So confident going in, now things are getting out of hand. Second Battle of the Marne, a big turning point. Germany surrendered in 1918, but tens of millions of people were dead. Imperial powers like Turkey gone too. The Treaty of Versailles and League of Nations wanted world peace, but that wouldn't happen. 20 years later, Germany wants revenge. The war to end all wars, led the war again. 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 Again.
And that is where we are going to end for this segment, with the ending of World War I. And you can see this picture shows kind of the mass destruction that was being